And so we come to the games of SG-1000, beginning with a trio of titles that most online sources indicate represent its day one launch titles: Borderline, Safari Hunting, and Insub. The presence of 3 arcade conversions at launch neatly parallels Nintendo's Famicom launch, and makes it easier to kind of compare and contrast the two systems and the two companies' respective approaches. Where Nintendo led with its biggest recent arcade hits, Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye, Sega's opening salvo of releases feel a bit more dated and a bit less popular. However, the term opening salvo is spot on because there's a decidedly martial tone to Sega's games, completely lacking in the competition's. We see all of these factors here at play in Borderline, SG-1000 catalog number G1001. Originally debuting for Sega's VIC-Dual arcade cabinet in 1981, Borderline was actually ambitious for its time, but it lacks a certain eye-catching pizzazz here in SG-1000 relative to the competition's lead offering, Donkey Kong. It's probably not entirely fair to compare the two home ports, since the Famicom hardware was literally designed to play a nearly perfect-looking conversion of Donkey Kong, while the SG-1000 was built around a more general-purpose spec. Despite its choppy vertical scrolling and single-color sprites, Borderline plays well, but it admittedly doesn't make the most spectacular first impression. The first stage of the game places players in control of an armed jeep, driving upward through what appears to be a trench or a jungle corridor. The sides of the trench are lined with small triangular objects that randomly detach from the walls and tumble toward the jeep, exploding immediately upon contact. The visual perspective in Borderline is, shall we say, tortuous. The jeep and tank sprites are drawn from a sort of isometric viewpoint that doesn't really jive with the strict top-down perspective of the environments. And while the vertical scrolling would initially seem to imply the player's jeep is driving forward along the ground, the way the defensive fragments peel away from the wall and plummet to the bottom of the screen in an arc makes it appear as they're being pulled by gravity. But what Borderline lacks in graphical cohesion, it makes up for with solid, classic-style arcade action. The first stage is easily the game's most challenging, sending players through a dangerous trench in order to reach a goal. Your forward progress is denoted by signs that indicate the distance to your target. Your jeep isn't precisely helpless, as it's armed with an infinite arsenal of missiles that can be fired in any of the 4 cardinal directions. Your horizontal targeting is especially handy for taking out the red missiles that line the walls, which offer bonus points and a tiny, almost imperceptible boost to your jeep's ever-dwindling fuel supply. Firing on obstacles with your jeep can be a little tricky because the projectiles are actually launched from a double-barrel situation that alternates between left and right with each shot. The tiny trench hazards are small enough that you have to line up a shot precisely to land a hit, so when you go plowing into a row of them, every other shot you fire will miss. Once you reach the end of the stage, the influence of Star Wars upon video games once again rears its head as the trench narrows and a set of targets, evidently a nuclear device of some sort, has to be destroyed, and then it's on to the next stage. It's at this point where Borderline reveals its true substance. Although the first stage somewhat resembles a vertical rendition of Konami's Scramble, the second through 4th stages turn out to be completely different in nature. The changes in format are every bit as dramatic as Donkey Kong's famous 4-stage structure, which was a huge selling point for Nintendo's game. And unlike the Famicom port of that game, Borderline manages to include all 4 levels on SG-1000. No cutting room floor cement factories here. Stage 2 works almost like Dig Dug as a shoot-'em-up, as your jeep carves a path through tall grass while avoiding enemy tanks and jeeps. The enemy forces are limited to patrolling areas free of grass, which allows you to duck out of hiding and launch missiles at them before they can react. Though the enemy vehicles respawn infinitely and will follow the paths you carve to hunt you down. While avoiding and destroying these patrols, your task is to destroy 9 more nuclear devices at the top of the screen, at which point you're whisked away to the 3rd stage. Here you'll find a simplistic grass-free maze, a little reminiscent of Atari's Combat, where enemies can move freely to track you as you attempt to destroy still more nuclear targets. And then at last, the 4th and final stage gives you a single target, a central reactor surrounded by walls and grass and guarded by enemy vehicles. You need to make your way through the grass while avoiding the opposition, carve a path through the narrow openings in the concentric walls, and take out the reactor without being destroyed in return by the reactor's own projectiles. It's a tough stage, but if you manage to succeed, you go back to the first level to do it all over again at a higher difficulty level. So it's a pretty limited game, but the variety of stage layouts and the shift from auto-scrolling to single-screen encounter spaces gives it enough variety to make for a more substantial arcade-style shooter than it initially appears to be. Even if it's not quite one for the ages, it's still pretty respectable for a 1983 console title. Next up we have Safari Hunting. If Borderline and its variety of level concepts made it a sort of analog for Donkey Kong, then Safari Hunting, with its journey through the jungle brush to capture animals for the zoo, makes it sort of a dark inverse mirror of Donkey Kong Jr., where Mario took a heel turn as a villainous zookeeper. The good news is that this is not a game about wantonly slaughtering wild animals, which would have been in poor taste in 1983 and downright awful today. In arcades, Safari Hunting was actually known as Tranquilizer Gun. Your goal here is to navigate a sort of Pac-Man-esque maze using your tranquilizer rifle to knock out various forms of exotic animals to stock up the zoo. It's a slower, more methodical game than the usual maze action title. Your hunter more or less creeps around the jungle paths, and he can only fire a single dart at a time. Your quarry doesn't roam freely around the wilds either. Instead, the animals will simply emerge from the foliage at random spots, then go back into hiding after a moment of wandering. You need to land a clean hit or multiple clean hits with your stun rifle during these moments while avoiding close contact with the creatures, which understandably will tear you limb from limb if they get a hold of you, or one assumes. The single color sprites aren't especially graphic, but the intent is unmistakable. Simply stunning an animal doesn't accomplish much though. Once you've sent a gorilla or lion into a deep sleep, you need to lug that slumbering critter back to your jeep in order to collect it, and, one assumes, send it to live a comfortable and humane existence at the world's most ethical zoo. You can also hop into your jeep and drive it around the perimeter of the maze for the sake of efficiency. There are several openings in the jungle, and you can station your ride at any one of them. The gameplay is a little bit random, and the action is a bit pokey, so it's not exactly the kind of thing to set hearts aflame here in the year 2021. But as an SG-1000 launch title, it did the trick of giving the console its very own maze game right out of the gate, practically a de rigueur requirement for game systems of the era, and one it would take the Famicom a year to make good on. Finally, rounding up the SG-1000's launch day titles, we have the only game not to feature a Jeep. No, it's InSub, a game about a submarine. That still keeps it in line with the military and shooting themes we've seen so far in SG-1000, and which makes it distinct from Nintendo and the Famicom and its cartoon whimsy. InSub, which I assume stands for Nuclear Sub, is merely another in the late 70s and early 80s endless array of Space Invaders style shooters. The arcade original debuted as a coin-op cabinet back in late 1980, when all of Japan was still in the thrall of Invaders Mania. As with the other launch titles for SG-1000, InSub began live as a VIC-Dual title. The VIC-Dual system was a plug-and-play cabinet design similar to Data East's Deco and Nintendo's Versus system, allowing two games to be housed in the same cabinet depending on which ROM boards the operator purchased and inserted into the cabinet. Co-developed by Sega and its fully owned American distributor Gremlin, which Sega would sell to Bally Midway around the same time that the SG-1000 debuted in Japan, the VIC-Dual ran on an architecture that shared a lot in common with the SG-1000, so it made sense for so many of these titles to be converted to the home platform, mostly by developer Compile. Notably, the VIC-Dual was the origin of Head-On, and for the arcade conversion of Heian-Kyo Alien. InSub is therefore, unsurprisingly, a pretty faithful arcade conversion. Though as with both Borderline and Safari Hunting, the arcade's vertically oriented screen layout obviously had to be converted to work on 4:3 consumer televisions. Despite this change, the SG-1000 port sticks closely to the original work. Players control a submarine that can maneuver freely through the underwater space in the lower third of the screen. The sub can fire torpedoes forward and upward toward the surface, allowing it to defend itself from enemy forces below the water, namely other subs, while destroying surface patrols. The goal of each wave is to completely clear out a fleet of rival ships on the surface. There's a bit of visual perspective applied to the ocean, as ships in the foreground appear larger and therefore are easier to hit than those in the background. Once the player wipes out an entire fleet twice, a quartet of destroyers enters the fray and circles around, dropping depth charges. Take out the destroyers and you move along to the next wave, where the action moves a little faster and enemies adopt a more aggressive stance. While the player scurries about underwater, the enemy's navy keeps things tense by sending a variety of anti-sub forces after the player. Submarines move in erratic forward patterns, launching torpedoes straight ahead anytime the player crosses their line of sight. The enemy fleet fires torpedoes downward as it advances, while large yellow homing bombs will occasionally plummet downward from the sky. Finally, the most dangerous foe is the mystery boat, clearly inspired by Space Invaders' Mystery Saucer. Rather than streak along at the top of the screen, however, the mystery boat zips quickly along the front edge of the water. Once it passes over the player's position, the mystery PT attempts to box in your sub with a pair of depth charges, with the pair becoming a trio and later a quartet as you advance through the waves. That's the extent of the game, really. The same formations over and over, moving ever faster, launching more and more projectiles at you. But that's really enough. It's a game that requires a bit of skill, but it's not as heavily stacked against the player as most shooters of this vintage. Once you get a feel for the patterns, it's not too difficult to keep a single credit going for 10 or 15 minutes. And there's just enough randomness in the appearance of the enemy subs and the PT boats to prevent the whole thing from feeling mechanical and rote. So in that sense, July 15th, 1983 offered a pretty effective summary of Sega's future. The one area in which the SG-1000 feels off kilter is in how underpowered the hardware itself appeared next to Nintendo's. But beyond here, Sega would go on to be the leader of each generation, setting a new technical benchmark for each wave of rival consoles to surpass. The SG-1000 would eventually evolve to take on that role itself, but it would be a couple of years before that happened. Here at the outset, Sega would find itself at a technical disadvantage to the Famicom, which isn't to say the company wouldn't deliver some pretty great games all the same, as we'll see. All in all, SG-1000's launch day offerings were pretty decent. If nothing else, they speak to Sega's arcade expertise, a tenet that would serve as the core of the company's console business from start to finish. Next time on Segaiden, we venture further into 1983 and the SG-1000 library.